How did you feel the last time you visited iTunes? A little bit overwhelmed? It seems like everybody and their dog has a show now. So what does every doctor need to know who's considering a podcast launch?
Welcome to the Doctor's Mentor Show. If you believe that medicine is an industry and not a profession, if you enjoy submitting complex reimbursement claims, or you would do another residency just for fun, be advised, you're about to be offended. You should probably leave now.
All this talk about mentoring doctors is ridiculous. I thought doctors learned to do everything better than everyone else the first year of medical school. At least that's the way they act.
If you love assisting patients with vitality breakthroughs, if the right to practice medicine without interference is important, and you want expert tips for practice freedom and profits to support your epic life, welcome aboard and prepare to be blown away. The Doctor's Mentor Show starts now. Here's your host, Dr. Lori Barr.
So what does every doctor need to know who is considering a podcast launch to increase profits and build docgitimacy? You'll find out.
Today's topic:
legacy.
Before I launched my show, which was now, I launched in January 2016, I started following the metrics and the trends in audio information delivery. And every late winter to early spring, there are a couple of statistical reports, surveys, large surveys that come out that give up-to-date information on what the current state of delivering audio information is. One of those is the Infinite Dial Report. That's a yearly report from Edison Research and Triton Digital. The second is the Podcast Consumer, which is also from Edison Research and Triton Digital. And the third is the Edelman Digital Trends Report. Now, another thing that is useful is to look at census data. The United States Census is an amazing tool, and you can find out all kinds of information by age, by other demographics, by profession. So that's another useful place to get some metrics. And now that I've launched my show, every year I am putting out the podcast forecast for doctors who are considering a podcast to increase profits and build docgitimacy. Remember, docgitimacy is a measure of a doctor's influence and power, perceived credibility, and trustworthiness. Do you have enough docgitimacy? Well, a podcast can help build docgitimacy and practice profitability. What is a podcast? A podcast is a digital audio periodical publication with a subscriber base. Let's look at the statistics. For 2017, 168 million people in the United States know what a podcast is. And there are 42 million weekly podcast listeners. So who are avid podcast listeners? 56% are men and 44% are women. 72% of podcast consumers ages 18 to 55 years old. 44% are 18 to 34 years old. Podcast listeners have a 10% higher annual household income versus the non-podcast listening U.S. population. 57% of podcast listeners have a college degree or advanced professional degree. 63% of podcast listeners are employed full-time. So how and when do podcast listeners listen? Podcast listeners spend a total of 5 hours and 50 minutes consuming audio per day. That's 2.5 hours more than average Americans, and 32% of that time is on podcast listening. 50% listen to more than 3 hours per week. The average is 5 hours, 7 minutes. They listen to an average of 5 podcasts per week, and they subscribe to an average of 6 podcasts. 85% listen to most or all of a podcast and usually download them and listen right away. 69% are listening from their smartphone or other portable tablet. In 2017, 81% of the U.S. population over the age of 12 owns a smartphone. That's an estimated 226 million people. Now, do you think a few of your ideal patients or clients might fall into this group? What about the influencers in your community? For marketing to be effective and meaningful, it needs to exist in the same range of motion as the customer's everyday activity. A podcast does just this. It is in the ear of your ideal listener for as long as your story is engaging. Weekly podcast listeners listen at home, at work, while on foot, using non-public transportation, and in motor vehicles. By the way, messenger programs like Messages and Facebook Messenger have surpassed social media platforms and users. Did you get that? There are 500 million more global monthly active users using the big four messaging apps than on the big four social media apps. So just a side note, if you're thinking about really focusing on Facebook Live or being live on your Twitter feed or some other way of being live on the big four social media apps, understand that the messenger programs have far more engagement. So think about that as you're planning your strategy for your marketing and your promotion and your publicity.
Your next step.
So, with regard to the forecast, if you'd like to know what I think a doctor should do who's considering a podcast launch in 2017 and what the forecast is for a profitable podcast by a doctor in 2017, then go to thedoctorsmentor.com and download your copy of the 2017 podcast forecast. It's waiting for you so that you can see, is it right for you to launch? How long should your podcast be? And who has a leg up this year? Now remember, a podcast is only one piece of a brand platform and must be profitable. Do you know if now is the right time to launch your podcast and build your docgitimacy? Take advantage of the Doctor's Mentor Profits Planning Session at thedoctorsmentor.com and find out your fastest path to practice profits. Remember, your first step is to go and download the podcast forecast so you can figure out if now's the right year for you to launch a show. And secondly, schedule time with me so we can talk about how that podcast may or may not fit into where you are in creating your ideal profitable medical practice.
There's more to explore at thedoctorsmentor.com.
Are you stopping at a hospital? Hello? Don't you know that hospitals are one of the sickest places on the planet? Don't touch anything in there and get out as fast as you can.